Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Okay, difference in repetition. Finally we are into chapter 3, the image of thought. And basically this chapter is a critical analysis of the way that philosophy has proceeded from what Deleuze will argue is an incorrect image of thought. And the way he's going to argue that is that the image of thought that philosophy begins with already presupposes a lot of things. So it's not getting to its starting point is not pure, if you like. It's not free from any preconceived notions already. And that's what we're going to start with today, the first section, a presuppositionless philosophy. So philosophy should begin without presuppositions. It should start from a point of complete purity, if you like. I don't know if that's the best word for that, but a point from which we're not presupposing anything. We haven't assumed anything. Nothing is being taken for granted. We want our start point to be free from any biases, basically. So philosophy should begin like that. It should have no presuppositions, but Deleuze asks, how is this possible? And he picks out a couple of philosophers to criticize for the way that they started their philosophies, and the way that they start them. It always involves a whole bunch of presuppositions. That's Deleuze's main idea here, main argument. So he starts looking at Descartes, and he says that Descartes avoided defining humans as rational animals the way that Aristotle did. And that this is a positive thing, because to start from the position that human beings are rational animals, to build your philosophy from there is presupposing that we are rational and that we are animals. And the idea here is to avoid any presuppositions. So that's good for Descartes. But Descartes then, instead of starting with rational animal, he ends up with this pure I think. And this I think, Deleuze says, presupposes the empirical self. And by that he means it presumes that everyone already knows what self, thinking, and being are. So I think, therefore I am, the cogito. I think if we're starting from that phrase, that if that's our launch pad into our philosophy, Deleuze is saying there's already a whole bunch of stuff in there that you are taking for granted. I think we're assuming that we know what it is to think. I think, therefore I am. We're assuming that we know what it is to be. And the I appears in both places there. So we're assuming we know what the self is. So all of these things, all of these presuppositions are buried, hidden inside that supposedly presuppositionless, bias-free, pure starting point. He also looks at Hegel and says something very similar there. Hegel's starting point was pure being, but pure being, Deleuze says, presupposes sensible, concrete, empirical being. So we've already, again, there's a presupposition that there's a whole bunch of assumptions being imported into a supposedly bias-free, assumption-free start point. And he also talks about Heidegger, and he doesn't say much about either Hegel or Heidegger. And about Heidegger, he just says Heidegger's pre-ontological understanding of being refuses objective presuppositions but contains many subjective ones. And fine, that's fine. The idea is the same. there's a lot that's being imported, a lot of ideas, a lot of assumptions being imported before you begin. But I would note that with Heidegger, the difference between him and Descartes and Hegel is Heidegger wasn't doing metaphysics, right? So I think that's a we'll come back, we'll cycle back to this point a little bit later, but it's a little bit unfair, I think, to lump Heidegger in with this category, because he's not doing metaphysics. He's not trying to uncover the reality itself, if you like. He is starting from a position. He is starting from the empirical. He says it. That's how phenomenology, or that's how ontology must proceed through phenomenology, which starts with the everyday. That was Heidegger's whole thing. So anyway, it's a little bit, I think it's a little bit unfair to lump Heidegger, to include Heidegger in that category, but still the idea is there. In order to get to an understanding of reality itself, a presuppositionless one, we have to avoid presuming anything. We have to avoid importing any assumptions. And that's the main idea there with those three criticisms. They all presuppose the empirical, and that's important. They all presuppose something, the everyday, the ordinary. We're taking the way that we understand things at this level, this empirical level, and trying to use that to understand metaphysical reality, or what Deleuze will call transcendental reality, transcendent reality. And that's the mistake. So anyway, Deleuze says, in order to kind of get a start point here, to orient ourselves a little bit, he asks, what is a presupposition? And he says that a presupposition is something everyone knows. So a presuppositionless beginning then must not know what everyone knows. Someone who neither allows himself to be represented nor wishes to represent anything. Not an individual endowed with goodwill and a natural capacity for thought, but an individual full of ill will who does not manage to think, either naturally or conceptually. Only such an individual is without presuppositions. Okay, so that's a little bit, not so happy with that particular idea. The idea, I think, behind it is good, is solid, but the way that the framework that Deleuze has presented here, I think, is a little bit odd. And a bit melodramatic, perhaps, a little bit over the top, but perhaps that's what he's going for. And a lot of Difference in Repetition is over the top, and especially some of his later works, Anti-Oedipus. Look at that; that's over the top in every way imaginable. But a presupposition. So the first problem, and I think this is where things go a bit astray regarding that quote, is that a proposition is something everyone knows. That's the definition. I don't think that's the best definition, which means that to get to the opposite, a presuppositionless beginning then is not to not know what everyone knows. That doesn't sound right. It can't be that to do philosophy you want to not know what everyone knows. It's I mean, you get the idea behind it, but it's just a misleading way to put it, I think. And so then you end up with this idea that the goal is to be an individual full of ill will, and that's, again, just too much, isn't it? Who doesn't manage to think. We're not thinking. Was Deleuze not thinking when he wrote Difference in Repetition? So it's just like, it just carries us in a direction, I think, that's a little bit over the top. But the basic idea, right, is solid. We have to think outside the box. We have to get outside the empirical box that we usually think within. The empirical presuppositions that we make that we don't realize we're making. That's what we want to get out and to get out of. And that's solid. The rest is a little bit over the top, but that's fine. And this is actually a Bergsonian idea. One of the something that I always remember from Berg. He never emphasized it. I don't think he emphasized it as much, certainly not as much as Deleuze does, but the idea that in order to think metaphysically, you have to start from the metaphysical. You can't start from the empirical and then try and build your way out to the metaphysical. You have to start at that level and then work your way in. And that's why Bergson said you needed an intuition. But even that word has become, it's fraught with misinterpretations, because it's not that kind of intuition. It's still thought. It's not like an alternative way of knowing to thought. You still have to think, but it's just a different way of thinking. It's a different way of approaching the subject matter, which in this case is metaphysics. So anyway, that is how we are kind of orienting ourselves regarding getting to a presuppositionless philosophy. The next section begins looking at the image of thought that philosophy has constructed and that Deleuze wants to break down. And so we start with the first postulate. So the first postulate is a principle, and it's the principle of goodwill and upright nature. So Deleuze starts off this little section by saying that philosophy moves away from the particular in favor of or towards the universal. So it abstracts out from the concrete, the particular, the individual, and attempts to grasp universal truths, things that are true for all of those particulars, which is fine. But the problem is that the universal that philosophy latches onto still has some kind of empirical-like content. And he calls it this matter or element. He says that the universal still has a matter in the same way that the empirical has actual matter. Just that in philosophy's case, it's a pure one or an ideal one. So what is this matter or this element? This element consists only of the supposition that thought is the natural exercise of a faculty, that there is a natural capacity for thought endowed with a talent for truth or an affinity with the true, under the double aspect of a goodwill on the part of the thinker and an upright nature on the part of thought. Okay, so thought is the exercise of a faculty. That's the first thing to think about here. In the same way that we have sensory faculties, and those are how we engage with or understand the empirical world, thought is being treated in the same way, as just another faculty, another way of knowing, another medium for knowing something out there. So already you can see how empirical biases are just being imported into our understanding of thought itself, our understanding of what's going on at this deeper level. So lots of presuppositions in there, but the main presupposition that Deleuze focuses on is that thought is naturally aligned with the true. Thought is naturally directed towards truth. It's about truth. It has as Deleuze says, an affinity with the true. And so this is what Deleuze calls the goodwill of the thinker and the upright nature of thought. This idea that, this presupposition that thought is naturally aligned with the truth in some way. It's naturally directed towards the truth, making us truth seekers, essentially, naturally. And that is, again, taken from the empirical, the way that we are directed towards the external world through our senses, and in an attempt to grasp reality, the external reality. And so we've just imported that idea into our understanding of thought. And what it does is, or what it amounts to, is a presupposition that we bring in when we're trying to understand thought specifically, but in a deeper sense, we're looking at the metaphysical aspect of thought, the metaphysical nature. How does thought arise? What's behind thought? So we're doing metaphysics, but we've got these presuppositions that are infecting our philosophical beginning already. So that was the first postulate anyway, the principle of goodwill and upright nature, this idea that the thinker is directed towards truth, and that's the purpose and the goal and the natural leanings of thought itself. Now we move to the second and third postulates, but we'll start with the third one because Deleuze does, and it kind of makes sense to start with the third one actually. But the third postulate anyway is a model, and this one is the model of recognition. So the model that philosophy begins with, Deleuze says, is recognition, which is the harmonious exercise of all the faculties upon a supposed same object. The same object may be seen, touched, remembered, imagined, conceived, all of these different, we have all of these different modes of access, if you like, to the object. And the harmonious coordination of all of those faculties together gives us, allows for the recognition of it. And that's the model that amounts to the third postulate. So multiple faculties converging upon a form of identity in the object is what the model of recognition is in essence. So there's that word identity. That's a clear sign that this is not where Deleuze wants to go. And recognition also requires the unity, another word that's a kind of a trigger word for Deleuze, the unity of a thinking subject behind the faculties. So we have this ground, this thinking subject, and then we have these faculties which are modalities of that subject converging harmoniously towards a same object, an object which is identical to itself. That's the model of recognition. But the model requires what Deleuze calls a subjective principle of collaboration of the faculties for everybody. In other words, in order for recognition to work, everybody's faculties, in order for recognition to work as a model, to do its job, to function as a model, everybody's faculties must converge on these objects in the same way. And this requires a common sense. And this is the second postulate. So the second postulate is an ideal. The first postulate was the principle, right? Goodwill and upright nature. Goodwill of the thinker, upright nature of the thought. The third postulate was the model of recognition. And the second postulate is an ideal, the ideal of common sense and good sense. So common sense is the norm of identity, is the way that Deleuze describes this. Norm of identity given from two ends. So it's a norm. In other words, it's a standard approach to something. It's the way that everybody does something, a custom, if you like, the norm of identity. So it's a norm which creates identity, gives us identity in the object, but also identity in the subject. So identity from two ends. Subjectively first, because we have the identity of the self, which serves, as we've already said, as the unity and the ground of all the faculties. But it's a norm of identity also objectively, in the sense that the object, which is revealed, the identity is in the object itself, which is the focus of those faculties. So the norm of identity, given from two ends, given subjectively as the unity of the faculties, and objectively as the identity of the object itself, which is the focus of the faculties. Just repeated that because I wasn't sure if I did it, if it came out clearly the first time. So common sense then contributes for Deleuze the form of the same. And again, that's another one of those key words. We've talked about identity in the model of recognition, identity in in common sense, the two forms of identity, those subjective and objective. But also it contributes the form of the same, which is another key word for Deleuze. So we talked about the two key words that kind of, in my mind, I always have associated when I'm reading Difference and Repetition, identity and sameness. They just seem to crop up all the time. Identity we've talked about in the model of recognition, and in that two forms of the two norms of identity. But common sense also contributes to the form of the same, in the sense, I think, that there's sameness in the object for everybody. Everybody sees the same thing. Everybody grasps the same object, and sameness for the object is the same for the same person at different times. So the object is being recognized as the same as it was the last time I viewed it, for example. And also the same in the sense that there is a subject viewing the object. So even though different subjects are different, there is a sameness to them in the sense that they have this, they're all operating through this model of recognition. They are the same kinds of things, this unity of these faculties which are harmoniously converging upon a single object. So that's common sense. And good sense is the norm of distribution. And what Deleuze means by this is it determines what each faculty contributes in order to qualify objects as this or that kind of thing. So it's another way of reinforcing the sameness, the conformity, I think would be a word that Deleuze would agree with here. The conformity that everybody has when they approach, they understand, they think about things. And by the way, it's not just like the physical form and shape and color and things of objects that we're talking about, but also the values that are associated with objects. So values also are part of this common sense and this good sense. And that's what determines what an object is. So there is a sense in which things are what they are, and we all agree that that's the way that they are, because we have this common sense and good sense which allow us, or which allows, probably not the word that Deleuze would use, but which force us into the same way of thinking about things. So that's the second postulate, the ideal of common sense and good sense. Okay, so let's move into the last section, which is DOXA. So DOXA is just belief, right? Common belief. In other words, presuppositions. It's the things that we take for granted when we think. Before we start thinking, it's all of the assumptions that we've taken on board already without realizing it. And philosophy tries to break with DOXA, refusing every particular DOXA, so abstracting from empirical content, but because in searching for the universal, it retains the operation of the faculties which correspond to that empirical content, it doesn't escape it. It doesn't get outside of it. So it retains too much of the empirical in its attempt to grasp the universal. Because what's retained is not the content itself, the empirical content itself, but the empirical way of thinking, the empirical, the thought that underlies, or the approach, the methodology, if you like, that underlies the way we understand the empirical. That has been imported unknowingly into our philosophy, into our attempt to grasp the universal, to abstract out from that content. So philosophy doesn't escape, it doesn't get outside of that empirical box. And the three essential aspects that remain in the DOXA of philosophy for Deleuze are form, element, and model. And the form is the goodwill of the thinker and the upright nature of thought, the first postulate. The element is common sense and good sense, the second postulate. And the model is the third postulate, recognition. Nice. And now he gives a couple of examples of some other philosophers and the way that they didn't get out of the doxa of the empirical. So he starts. The first example is Kant, and of Kant, Deleuze says he ends up simply multiplying common senses. So he ends up multiplying the way that we approach the object. So talking about the subject and the faculties and the way that they converge on the object, which is the same, which is identical, all of that stuff. So he just ends up multiplying common senses, and we end up with these extra three: imagination, reason, and the understanding, and they all collaborate to yield knowledge. So understanding dominates in the speculative model in the form of, Deleuze says, a logical common sense. Reason dominates in the practical model in the form of a moral common sense. And imagination dominates in the realm of aesthetics in an aesthetic common sense. And those obviously map onto Kant's three critiques: pure reason, practical reason, and judgment. Okay, fine, that's Kant. And he also, so this is where he brings in phenomenology again and says phenomenology grounds philosophy on a fourth common sense, namely sensibility. And he says, yes, this is for sure an doxa, but it's still doxa. So it still hasn't gotten outside the empirical. And as with what I said about Heidegger, I would say exactly the same thing about phenomenology here. The criticism is slightly misplaced, because phenomenology, Husserl, Heidegger, those guys were never interested in metaphysics. No, they were not trying to understand how thought arises, or what thought is, where it comes from, what kind of, what's behind the curtain, as it were. They're starting from that position. They're starting from our position as being in the world. That was the whole thing. That was the whole point of phenomenology. That's what makes it what it is. So this criticism is really a metaphysical criticism of phenomenology, which is not metaphysics. In essence, it's critiquing phenomenology for being phenomenology and not for being metaphysics, which is a little bit unfair, I think. So anyway, but the point still stands. You get the idea. These things haven't gone beyond the empirical. They haven't escaped that empirical box. And then we get to Nietzsche, and so this is the ideal. This is Deleuze's model, if you like. So with Nietzsche, we get this distinction between the creation of new values and the recognition of established ones. So the new is forever new. It can begin again and again, i.e. repeat, because it's fundamentally difference. Not different, not the adjective, it's fundamentally difference, the noun. It's difference in itself. And so because of that, its approach is different. Its approach is, it's less about the content and more about the structure, the way that values are being approached, the way that reality is being understood in this model. Or maybe I should just keep going, and then we'll try and flesh out some of the difference between the two. So that's new anyway. Forever new can begin again and again because it's difference. And established values, they're always established even from the moment of their inception. They're established. Why? Because they're grounded in recognition. They're grounded in identity and sameness. And so again, well, this is the difference between the two. Then we have creation of new values, which embraces difference. It embraces that chaos that we talked about, which is metaphysical reality, which is difference in itself. Nothing is harmonious at that level. There's this interplay of different forces and drives, and it's an active, dynamic, changing landscape from which you can get the new, which is always new, because it's grounded in this way of understanding reality. It takes that metaphysical picture and builds from it. That's what makes it new, fundamentally new, always different. Whereas the established doesn't operate with that. It doesn't treat reality that way. It treats reality as borrowing those assumptions from the empirical. So everything is, you have the self-same identical subject with faculties, multiple faculties that converge harmoniously upon a self-same identical object. And that picture, that way of understanding, that way of doing philosophy, and the way of living is fundamentally identity and sameness. So, and that makes it already established. Even if the idea you have is new, it just becomes a different form of something that's already been there, something that's already something already established, because it's following that same mold, if you like. So we have, like with Kant, multiplying common senses. We're not getting anything new, we're just getting new forms of common sense, as opposed to Nietzsche, where we're getting something radically different because it's founded in this picture of reality itself as this chaotic, dynamic, ever-changing maelstrom of different forces mapping onto each other in different ways, and all of that stuff that we talked about in prior videos. No spatio-temporal kind of restrictions. It's all this inchoate mass of movement, which is nothing until something arises, until something forms, and that gives it its newness. So that's the idea. And it sounds good, but this is where Deleuze and I start going in different directions a little bit, because this, to me, starts drifting into more like anarchy, actually, than anything else. And this is something that this is one of the reasons I didn't like Anti-Oedipus, was because that's kind of the thread running through the whole book, is this idea that, what does he say? You've got, we're desiring machines, and society, government, capitalism, they're all codifying and restricting these flows of desire. That's their purpose, and we have to break free of that. We have to step outside that and keep our flows free, unimpeded. That's kind of the goal, and that's the message. And I think that's where his later philosophy goes as well, which is obviously the segue into postmodernism too, which I think is not right. That doesn't appeal to me at all. And the mistake, I think, is that, so Deleuze points out the error in philosophy, which imports its ideas from the empirical into the metaphysical or the transcendent. And so it doesn't break away from those presuppositions. It carries those assumptions through with it. But Deleuze is doing the exact opposite here. He's taking the metaphysical, drawing that picture, which is difference in itself, it's chaos, it's dynamism, it's always changing, and importing those ideas into the empirical. And when you do that, either way, whenever you cross that divide, it's wrong. You're always going to make mistakes. And Deleuze has pointed out the mistake you make going from the empirical to the metaphysical, but he's doing the same mistake just in reverse, going from the metaphysical to the empirical. So if you try and base your empiricism on your metaphysics, you end up with a picture that just won't work, I don't think, which is why I call it anarchy, because no one should conform to anyone else's expectations. Government, it's solely to restrict and control and manipulate, and we should rebel and revolt and all of those exciting ideas. But you just can't have society like that. It just won't work. There has to be some give and take, and this is why I think it's too absolutist to go either way, to say that this is the empirical and then to understand the metaphysical based on that, or to do the opposite, to say this is our metaphysical picture, this is reality as it really is, and then base your everyday, base your concrete everyday empirical life on that. You can't do it. And so this I think is kind of the starting point for Deleuze, where he carries off on that train of thought, which leads to things like Anti-Oedipus and postmodernism, which comes in later as well. And that like I said, that for me, it's those two realms are different, and there is no crossing them. And when you do, you end up with problems either way. But anyway, that's just my thoughts on that. So there's a final quote that I want to leave you with. On the one hand, it is apparent that acts of recognition exist and occupy a large part of our daily life. But who can believe that the destiny of thought is at stake in these acts, and that when we recognize, we are thinking? So that's a good quote, I think, because it pretty much captures exactly what I was trying to say. On the one hand, we have acts of recognition. They make up a large part of our everyday existence, our empirical lives. But, as Deleuze says, who can believe the destiny of thought? Who can believe that this is the metaphysical picture of thought, that this is reality, thought as it really is, that this is grasping the core, the heart of what thought is, what thinking is. Who can believe that when we recognize we're thinking? These two things are just on different levels. One's at the level of the empirical, one's at the level of the metaphysical, or the transcendent, as Deleuze would probably prefer to call it. But we have those distinctions. We have them. And I would add, you can't mix them either way. Mixing them, crossing that divide either way is a mistake. But for Deleuze, the emphasis is on moving from recognition to thinking, and he's right, because you can't take those presuppositions and apply them to metaphysics and expect to get a metaphysical picture that is correct. To understand thought, we have to go beyond the empirical. But to go beyond the empirical means to go beyond all of those three postulates that we've talked about in this video, because they all smuggle empirical ideas empirical presuppositions into the metaphysical. All right, let's check a summary. So first, we talked about the goal of this chapter, which is to outline a presuppositionless beginning for philosophy. And the problem was that all prior philosophy presupposes the empirical in some way. It presupposes empirical ideas and tries to use those to understand what's not empirical, to understand the ground for the empirical. And this means moving beyond DOXA, moving beyond common belief, getting beyond those ingrained assumptions we have that we don't realize we have. Then we talked about the image of thought itself, and we started looking at what this is comprised of, by looking at the first three postulates. The first was the principle of goodwill of the thinker and the upright nature of thought. The second postulate, the idea of common sense and good sense. So this revolved around norms of identity and distribution. Identity appearing in the subject and in the object, and the distribution, norms of distribution being what determining what each faculty contributes in order to make the thing that it is. And importantly, common sense and good sense include values as well, not just the physical form or shape of a thing. And the third postulate, the model of recognition. And here faculties converged harmoniously on an object for a subject which was a unity. So again, identity and unity all through that picture. And that's us for today. That's where I'm going to leave you. So that's the first part of the image of thought and the first three postulates that make up that. And we'll go through the rest of those postulates in the forthcoming videos. Thanks for watching. I hope this helped in some way, and I'll catch you next time.